I'm Erica Gonzalez, joined by Soraya Chemaly. We are the co-hosts of WMC Talks, which was launched by the Women's Media Center to center narratives, how the way women, so many brilliant women in progressive spaces and such different spaces, from housing to feminist studies, et cetera, are looking at narrative and power, especially in the context of these times, and looking at creating space for the conversations that are not happening in legacy media. So we've been able to bring such powerhouse women over several months into conversation, and we're looking forward to having a chat today about some of the powerful points they brought to the forefront.
Yes, I think we were so fortunate to have the people that joined us. And if you're watching this after the fact, all of our conversations are available on the Women's Media Center page. But we did this really not just to be critical of legacy media and think about where the holes might be, but because the voices that we want to bring into the conversation are really focused on creating better futures, on developing the kinds of approaches to public understanding and narrative that can help us change the world. And so I was very grateful to them. I think maybe one way to really start off is with some of the central themes that cut across everyone that we spoke to in our conversations. And the one that really comes to mind to me is the way that the persistent notion of there being a neutral idea of objectivity in the media ends up repeatedly marginalizing people who are already marginalized, because that idea of objectivity is so grounded in the belief that whiteness and maleness and those two things together are neutral, that they don't have gender or race or ethnicity or other forms of status in society. And that, I think, just came up over and over and over again, because across everyone that we spoke to, these people are striving to have other stories told, deeper stories told, the stories of the people actually affected by the news told by those people themselves. Do you feel that that's sort of an accurate depiction of the theme?
Definitely, yes. That and power, and one of the striking points that when I was listening to your conversation with Leah Goodrich on housing, which is what, like, the most pressing issue.
Yes.
And when I say that, I mean it relates to mental health, to
Everything.
everything, right? And the point that she brought up is that sometimes as organizers or as media, we're talking to people who are in the middle of this deep crisis that's affecting just all lanes of their lives, and telling them, coming with a very approach like, well, we've got to act now, or this is going to happen, and we're not even mindful or conscious of the trauma that that person has already been through. And I feel like that's one of when I thought, because I read a lot of housing, a lot of articles on housing, and I'm like, wow, that kind of moment, that understanding, that layeredness is really missing from a lot of housing coverage, just the way people are feeling in the middle of it.
Well, and it goes along, I think, with that notion of objectivity is also this idea that there is no knowledge in emotionality, right? And that
Right.
feelings cannot take precedent. And in fact, that doesn't only have to do with the subject of a story, right? It has to do with the reporter, it has to do with the editor. And in many cases, we really don't want to talk about it in the case of sexual violence. Those people have feelings about that topic, right? Even if they don't express those feelings overtly. And so in the same way that in the housing conversation, talking about the trauma of the displaced, or even the trauma of the advocate, or the trauma of the journalist who may have had those experiences, um, in the same way that that operates there, we see that operating in other contexts, like sexual violence. So that, like at the Washington Post a few years ago, a very experienced journalist, a woman, was fired eventually for having said something about a rape case in Twitter. she was considered not objective because she herself had experienced rape. And yet no one is asking, what about the objectivity of people that have probably perpetrated sexual violence and hold positions of power in the media, right? That's sort of a Me Too,
Right.
separated, it's thought of as a Me Too story. And yet those dynamics work all the time in newsrooms.
Right, right. And you know, and just taking a step back, we're not talking about putting emotions on display in a way that's like trauma porn, you know. So
Right.
what we're talking about, as you outlined, is like the power that operates that, and
Through
the
trauma.
power that operates within that, you know.
Right. Yeah.
One of the Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. One of the what?
No, you know, you had said something about one of the things that that I thought about was a conversation with Anne Leonard, who put out this book on protest, and just this sort of, you know, when I think about trauma, and we think about like people freezing in these times, like we were already under serious pressure. I mean, you see it in cities like, you know, you see like the level of homelessness, you see like the economic pressure on people, the racism that's like running even deeper than ever. And it's, you know, we were already tilting in that direction. Now we have this sort of this doubling down structurally, you know, and even, you know, and beyond that. So it it was interesting to have that conversation with Anne Leonard and look beyond like, well, what does it mean to kind of unfreeze, and that may look differently for people. So like, you know, and
Right.
I think of having been in journalism, the coverage around protests is like when the protest happens and everybody takes to the streets, and that's like, you know, how many numbers, who, you know, how are people critiquing government and administrations. But her thing about the way her conversation about the way people quietly do not cooperate, you
Mhm.
know, and then and how do we kind of like, I don't know if it's double
Yeah.
track, but like not cooperate and hold space for trauma, the way we're all feeling overwhelmed.
I think that goes back really importantly again to how media, the media principle of objectivity and rationality, right? And
Rationale.
that, for example, drives a lot of framing of coverage that's focused on metrics and numbers and
Yes.
graphs and
Right.
percentages and data. And that's all important. Like I am, as a writer, I love that stuff. I love research. I love looking at the numbers, but that's only part of the story. It cannot be the whole story, right? And what happens is that that orientation of thinking, well, that's neutral, which numbers are never neutral. Let's just put that there to begin with, right? Numbers are produced as a result also of framing of questions of how surveys are conducted. So I don't want to pretend that that's not the case,
Right.
but it's still not enough, right? Because without the real stories of what the numbers mean, not just in an instant, like we really are in a media environment driven by instance, not by deep coverage, not by deep analysis, not by deep reading. We know all of those things. But that focus on the virality and the instantaneity, it's so corrosive, particularly when you consider the fact that probably across all of the people we spoke to, another common thread is that care and community and connection in how we think of stories and the news are really central. And all of those things take time, right? They take time to create, to maintain, to sustain. Um, and that's what doesn't really come out in so many stories that we're, I think, capable here in this series of surfacing, of saying, no, let's pause. What does it really mean when housing is not affordable? It's not just a market issue, right? All
Right.
market issues are people issues, and yet we don't hear it that way.
We don't hear it that way. And I think, you know, what's interesting is for all the numbers, et cetera, you see people who are independent, public historians or analysts on social media, on IG and other platforms who have been able to amass these huge followings because they're speaking just with a power analysis on what's unfolding. And I think that that's the appeal, because people feel like I'm not getting something here and I'm getting it from this person.
Right.
I'm getting a sort of like, it made me think of some of the issues that were raised by like Marcy Bianco and Maria Teresa Peterson on some of like these default narratives. Marcy talked about the equality mindset and just and we talked about it being a movement or a tactic for some time, and now having to be looked at and shifted. And her point of view is that it's like, equality is not a feeling, it's an artifice. It's like, do I wake up saying, oh, I'm feeling equal today or not? And her point of view is that we've been conditioned to reach this kind of bar that men have as women, to reach that bar, to kind of be in the same scheme, same place of choices when men are not even equal. So she was raising a lot of the faultiness, and also Maria Teresa Peterson, when I raised Latina Equal Pay Day. And she just kind of like, if we're going to talk about Latina Equal Pay Day, we have to talk about immigration reform. And the reason why there's such a gap is because many Latinas are exploited. So until, and are working off the books or doing other stuff that they're forced to do, take a paid below living wage, as many Americans are, and just kind of like, just the clear point that we have to have a deeper conversation
and complex conversations. I mean, I think the problem with a lot of mainstream coverage, whether you're talking about politics or religion or education, whatever the climate, is that there is this inclination to look at things along one axis, maybe class or maybe race. And I think for you, for me, for the people that we're talking to, it's never one axis, right? It's multiple axes. And in terms of what we do at the Women's Media Center, it's always an axis that intersects. All these axes include gender. Even in mainstream coverage, if you get more complicated analysis, it will often, for example, if you're looking at economics, it might consider race and class. But all three, race, class, and gender, or race, class, and sexual identity, or gender identity, it just is so rare. It's I was talking to someone yesterday, and
by the way, sorry to interrupt, but that makes me miss Bell Hooks so much. Not that she's on, but it's just like, she was so clear about naming all of the systems. And there's a video of hers that I have saved where she talks about, I mentioned all the systems so no one can break them off.
Yes, you have to say the words out loud. And, sometimes it's a mouthful, that's the thing. And it's a mouthful because it's effective it's effective. We have to be able to name it. But I was talking to someone yesterday, and I was remembering the sort of early days of CGI and animated films. And a lot of us kind of protested the depiction of women in those animations. And also that there were so few women in those animations, especially for children. And the response from the industry was, well, women's hair is just too complicated to draw. It's just too hard to make those figures, which even then sounded absurd. But in fact, in media, there's a corollary, which is it's simply too complicated to look at all these data together, and we don't have the right data because you're not asking the right questions, right? Or it's not, it's not relevant. It's too small a percentage of consideration. And all of us know, everyone we talk to understands why that is a misrepresentation of reality, because the embodiment of these things is a fact of life. And so not, being able to address it in the news is more and more vital as people feel more and more precarious.
Yes. And, speaking of misrepresentations of reality, I think back to the conversation with Rebecca Nagel, who's been really, as everyone, there's been very limited narratives about the 250th anniversary. I mean, there was a lot of play given to Ken Burns and his sort of flawed flawed character kind of lens, and Rebecca's been doing a great job at really talking about, well, what really happened at the founding of our nation and why, and then showing the through line, like
Right.
why, which which is so powerful about the women that we talk to that are so good at showing the through line, just talking about like, yeah, it's no surprise the way immigrants are being rounded up, because this is the kind of stuff that was done to natives,
Well,
and
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, the theme also, another theme that cut across all of our conversations was what I think of as a form of media refusal, right? Just this idea that in any way, shape, or form, what we're seeing is variations on refusing that media. It may be people turning to creators online, independent journalists, but it's also people like Rebecca creating new media,
right.
writing the stories, telling the stories, archiving the stories, talking about the stories. Otherwise, people won't know them. Like the whole reason that we exist as an organization, that she and Annie and Nicole, like everyone we talk to, all of the work that they do involves two parts, which is building this alternative reality for the future, this imaginative reality, but also having to simultaneously tell people about it, right? To actually tell them, hey, this exists. We are not invisible. We are doing this work. Come and look at it, understand it, because you're not going to find it in mainstream legacy media.
Right, right. And it makes me think of like Jennifer Maritza Macaulay and her venturing, well, not venturing because she's been in that space, into Afrofuturism, and with her book, and looking at, well, how do we imagine using this genre? How do we imagine possibilities? And also reminding people that Black people have been in that space for some time. They haven't been the projection as usual as is done in other spaces.
Right.
And also someone like Nicole Carr, who is writing about at one time you had all of these medical facilities and training facilities that were attached to HBCUs. And then you have the Neutral Eye Commission come to standardize stuff. And then you had that dismantled, and how that affected Black doctors and Black healthcare, and the point that you were making earlier before about what is valued and what is not, and how she speaks to the role of doulas who've been in existence since the beginning of time, and how they're not valued
Right.
because they're not seen through the same way of they're not seen through the eye of professionalism.
That's right. I think that it's really interesting because really when we talk about media, what we're talking about is knowledge production, knowledge monopolization, knowledge
Yeah,
structures, and
right.
things like rationality and objectivity and professionalism. Leah has written about professionalism in her own, as a lawyer and as an advocate. And to go full circle, the way her own emotionality or her recognition of the trauma of the people she's helping, or even as a journalist, I think you will appreciate this. I appreciate this. Your own secondary or vicarious trauma as a witness to those things, right? Even if you
Right.
haven't experienced it yourself, as a recorder and a witness, you're going to have impacts. None of it registers as real, legitimate, or important. As a matter of fact, the opposite, it registers as not professional, not objective, not relevant. And that is a way of continuing the monopolization of information and authority and everything that comes with knowledge, right? And so all of these refusals that we discussed with our guests, I think, are vitally important because they're creating other knowledge systems, other sources of
Yes.
authority, other ways that the public can think about the world, that they may not be exposed to otherwise.
Right, right. And I was thinking also about your conversation with Tia Levings on trad wives, and how she was really, and we've seen it come to
Yes.
pass, and you've warned about this, but this treatment of it as like, oh, this is a fringe, and then how it's becoming legitimized, the ability of so many women to see ahead, and she had direct experience with this.
She left a very dangerous, oppressive religious movement. She had that experience, and she's written extensively about it, and she thinks very politically about it. And it was great to be able to talk to her, because it's one thing to be outside of those systems and critique them. It's another thing, though, to have lived within them and critique,
Right.
and that's why it's important that we find the people who have firsthand experience of what media is talking about,
Right.
and very often, unfortunately, they are not centered in these stories,
Exactly.
or they're centered in a way that's very paternalistic, or dismissive. And the refusal to go along with that is, I think, really central to the series for us, because whether we meant to or not, it turns out that everybody we spoke to had this critique, but also this expansive imagination for what
Yes.
can be possible, which I really appreciated. Like, came out a lot in every one of your conversations, that and the ones that I had as well. I think what was so heartening about those conversations was that we can acknowledge the difficulties. We can acknowledge the wholesale dismantling of decades of civil rights, of women's liberation, of attempts to mitigate climate change, whatever the issue might be. We can acknowledge that, but that didn't lead any of these people to despair.
Right. Right. And something I don't mean to like veer from this conversation. I want to come back to it, but something that when we were talking about emotionality and how it's delegitimized and there's no space given to it. I was thinking about how it also depends. I think about Anderson Cooper when he was underground after Hurricane Katrina and visibly just like upset,
Yeah.
and how that just became, all of a sudden that became a conversation
Yes, it was
because
okay.
a white man was able to,
Yeah.
so it happened in that space. So it became like okay for that, right? And it had to
Right.
be like that extreme, but not like
Mhm.
the housing trauma that Leah's talking about. So, but in terms of identifying power, the knowledge production in alternate spaces, and just pushing out, and I think about someone like Nicole Carr, who's writing about talking about like naming of the exclusion of Black medical professionals and what
Right.
the impact of that, but also that her research is looking at Black people I'm going to use self-emancipated because it
Yes.
was really like all of that happened because
Yes.
of their own pressure and movement and
And
organizing and vision.
self-determination.
Self-determination, yeah. So her research is looking at Black people who left the United States
Mhm.
after the Emancipation Proclamation and said, I'm going to look at my own project, but elsewhere. And
Right.
many of them, some of them started publications elsewhere, including women. So I'm fascinated by that because that's a story we haven't heard.
Mhm.
Obviously, we've long known about the treatment of Native people, but the detail and depth that Rebecca goes into
Right.
on her platforms, and then, Annie, for example, just saying like, it's, this is where we're at. And the
Mhm.
way we've been protesting because we're in this different space, that's just there were signs of it already before, right? And here and there,
Mhm.
or like we've seen it throughout history, but we have to have a different response for a different time, so just this
Right.
understanding that exercising the knowledge production, exercising our agency, self-determining on platforms that make themselves available to do that, or creating our own platforms, are really the circle around. And what I think was interesting, I think for most of the conversations we asked the women, who do you follow? What do you follow?
Yeah.
And I don't think any of them named legacy media.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think too, their work is emblematic of something else going on that ties right back into all these themes, which is that mainstream legacy media really only recognize protest, again, in a very narrow band. Like, they understand as an analytical framework people protesting on the street, the traditional way that Europeans, particularly European men, protested oppressive government. So that's legible, right? But the forms of protest that marginalized people, particularly marginalized women, have to engage in don't look like that. And so they don't get registered as political. They get categorized, as we've said before, as a private choice,
Right.
as a personal issue, right? But what I'm seeing, which is what, for example, Tia was talking about, is what happens when women refuse the social contract of traditional white American heteropatriarchy? What happens when they refuse it and it doesn't look like a march on the street, right? That's the kind of reorientation that I really loved in a lot of our conversations, which illustrates how the traditional, traditionally narrow lens on how you define things impedes us, and we don't want that, right? We want to broaden the lens as widely as possible, and when you do that, you can then see various forms of protest, solidarity, mutual care, mutual aid, and resistance all together as
Yeah.
as a distributed kind of headless protest, right? We
Right.
also in media really love the hero, right? We love the man who is leading the fight. And if you don't have a movement that looks like that, if you don't have that man, you're going to get less coverage, And so I just like having the opportunity to even talk to these people who are doing this amazing work.
Yes, agree. So who are a couple of people or outlets that you follow, um, that you look to for the kind
Honestly,
of conversation
that's
that,
such a good question. I mean, can I name them offhand? There's so many. First of all, I went from really not being in Substack to really appreciating really thoughtful people doing very serious writing in Substack. Um, and I have just found that in the clutter of media, that is a good place to pause for me personally. I also tend to look every day at international media,
yeah,
uh, a sort of media like coming out of the UK, looking at Al Jazeera. When I can, I don't speak Spanish very fluently, so when I can in translation, I'll try and look for, Hispanic media across the South America and Central America. I also tend to have a couple of sources of media across Southeast Asia and Africa. It's very hard for me. It's very hard just to capture everything. So
right.
I'm not consistent every day, but I do try and really stay as aware as possible of things that are happening, across continents, because we're all living in this same, it's so dynamic, everything is so entwined. But it's also just really good for me personally, I think, to see what other countries and other thinkers are saying about what's happening here.
Yes, yes, agree. Well, I've been like super excited about this is our first season doing this, and we're taking a month-long break, and we're going to come back in the fall with some more brilliant women to talk about domestic workers' rights, to talk about race, to talk about
Technology. But wait, can I
technology.
interrupt you?
Yes, of
You didn't tell
course.
me what are your news sources?
Oh, I think I have. It's so diverse. Like and depends on what it is. Like I love like Tressie McMillan, her
Yes.
her breakdowns of power and what's going on, and she had a really good piece recently on the whole fiasco with the
Partner?
main, yes, Plattner, yes.
Yes,
So sort
great.
of like, so it was great. So I look for that stuff where it's like there's sort of like the news in the day that I get just about like what's been happening, but the pullback, having the person who can and then also like international as well. Like look at Novara Media,
Yeah.
so and I think that there are a lot of people who are individually like young scholars who are talking about stuff in different ways, race, colorism, gender, the way people resist. When you were talking, I was thinking about the way carnival has been described, like the grotesque that are used also, and mask making as like people pushing out of boundaries and also like offending the white upper class, sensibilities, like that kind of stuff. So just in terms of like when you really look at like the scale and the diversity of resistance. So yeah, it depends on, obviously I look at somebody like Indian country, Rebecca Nagel, for the Native American perspectives. And I mean, they're really quite good at just keeping up like weekly reporting. And there are a bunch of great people on the Latino front, the Latino newsletter, for example, that's constantly publishing from this perspective, this side of the water. So, but yeah, I kind of feel like we could pull a list together based on what some of the women have said, recommended almost, and maybe share that at some point. But I'm excited for all we're going to be diving into in the fall.
Well,
and it's been great.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'd like to thank people for joining us,
Yes.
either live or afterwards. We really appreciate it so much. And we're looking forward to having many, many more people over the course of the next year.
Definitely. And then, as Soraya said, we have this knowledge base. So it's right on our YouTube page. You can look at all the conversations. We mentioned excellent points, so expansive. They're short burst conversations, so you can listen as you're driving or as you're putting your meal together and what have you.
Putting meal together, picking up kids.
I do want to mention my friend's book. If you have not read, please add this to your list, because Soraya makes me think about just so many things that are not put on our radar by the news of the day. So thank you so much for that contribution, and look forward.
And thank you for this conversation today.
Definitely. All right, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be back in September.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to our team. Honestly, we need to say thank you to everybody at the Women's Media Center.
Yes, thank you so much
for organizing us, getting us into this today. Yes, thank you.